The coffee cup hit the floor first. It shattered against the checkered linoleum of the Starlight Diner with a sound that nobody who heard it would ever forget. A truck driver 3 booths over would tell his
Hi, table for
grandchildren
two,
about that
please.
sound.
Of course,
The
right
waitress
this way.
behind the
How about
counter
this
would
booth
hear
by
it
the
in her
window?
sleep
This is
for the
perfect,
rest of her
thank
life.
you. Great,
It was the
I'll get you
sound
some
of
menus.
something
Thanks,
breaking
Ruby.
that wasn't supposed to break. The sound of a Friday evening in late October coming apart at the seams. Then came the slap. Open palm, full shoulder behind it. The crack of
There
skin
she
on skin
is.
echoed through the
Right on
diner like
time.
a rifle shot in a
Hey,
canyon.
over here!
And for one
Easy, we're
suspended
coming.
heartbeat, every patron in the Starlight froze in place. Forks hovered above
This is
plates.
impossible. It's me.
Coffee steamed
And that's me.
untouched
How
in
did they
chipped
know?
mugs.
This
The
is too
jukebox
specific.
in the
It's like
corner
the
kept
sauce.
playing an old
We
Merle
need to
Haggard
find out who
song
made these.
nobody
I
remembered
agree.
putting on, and somehow that made
Whoa!
it worse. A 14-year-old girl in
Hi,
a motorized
I'm so
wheelchair
sorry. Are you okay?
was
I think
thrown
so, but that
sideways
really
by the force
hurt.
of the blow.
I'll need
Her
to help
head
you up.
snapped to the
Thanks,
right.
but please be careful.
A worn leather sketchbook tumbled from the table and skidded across the floor. Charcoal pencils rolling in 3 directions. A bright red handprint bloomed across her pale cheek like a
We need to
flower
stick
opening in
together
fast
now.
motion,
Sticking together
and her
got us
mouth
into this
fell
mess.
open in a silent,
Please, no
breathless
more
cry.
fighting.
He's right.
Outside, beyond the
We leave
dust-streaked windows
Tonight,
of the
that's too
diner,
soon.
the desert
I know.
night was beginning to hum.
okay.
It started
here.
low at first, the
I
way
can't
thunder
do
starts
this.
when a storm is
Yes,
still
you
10
can.
miles out.
Breathe.
A vibration you felt in
I'm
your boots
scared.
before you heard it in your
I've got
ears.
you. We're okay.
The water glasses on the
Whoa,
tables
look
began
at
to
these
tremble.
drawings.
This
The
one
neon
looks like a
starlight
secret
sign
meeting.
above the parking
And the
lot, the
notes are
one
in
missing
code.
its teeth since
Let me see the
2018,
next page.
flickered
It
once and
connects
held.
to this figure here.
And the 3
is
young men
incredible.
standing over the broken
Welcome,
girl in
brothers
the
and
wheelchair
sisters.
turned
We
their
ride
heads
not just
toward
for
the
the thrill, but
sound.
for the
And for
unbreakable
the
bond of
first
freedom
time
we
in their
share.
privileged,
Together
untouched
we conquer
lives,
these
they
roads,
understood what
united
fear
in
actually
spirit and
felt like.
chrome.
30
Let's
of our
ride.
Harley-Davidson engines were rolling
Hey,
into
what
the
are you
parking
drawing?
lot of the Starlight Diner.
It's a secret.
And the men riding them did
Can I
not
see
yet
when it's
know
done?
what had just happened inside.
Okay, but you have
But
to
they
wait.
were about to find out. And once they did, the entire town of Kingman, Arizona would never quite be the same again. To understand how the worst night of Lachlan Ashcroft's life began, you have to go back 6 hours. Back to a slow Friday afternoon when the long shadows of the Hualapai Mountains were just beginning to stretch across the desert floor, and a beat-up white Ford Econoline van was rolling east on Route 66 with its windows down and the radio playing soft. The driver was 24 years old, and his name was Tobias Caldwell. Most people called him Toby. He had the kind of hands a man earned the hard way, knuckles split and rehealed 100 times, palms permanently darkened by engine grease that no amount of soap would ever lift. There were calluses on his calluses. He wore a faded denim work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and a wedding band on his right hand that had belonged to his father. His own father had been buried wearing the matching one. In the passenger seat, secured by a custom harness and surrounded by foam supports, sat his 14-year-old sister, Maren. Maren had been born with severe cerebral palsy. Her body had betrayed her from the very first breath, locking her muscles into unpredictable rhythms, robbing her of the simple coordinations most children learn before they can speak. Her hands trembled. Her jaw worked overtime to form even the simplest words. Her legs had never carried her weight, and they never would. The doctors who had delivered her in a county hospital outside Flagstaff had pulled Toby's mother aside and used careful words about expectations and quality of life. But none of those doctors had looked into Maren's eyes. If they had, they might have seen what Toby saw every single morning, Islam, behind the tremors and the labored speech and the wheelchair and the endless medical paperwork. Maren Caldwell possessed a mind as sharp and clean as polished steel. She remembered things. She remembered everything. Faces she had seen once 3 years earlier, she could still draw from memory down to the freckle. The exact angle of a stranger's smile. The way light fell across a stranger's hand. Her brain was a camera that never stopped recording, and her sketchbook was the album where she kept the negatives. She was in the small ways the world allowed her to be an artist. "You ready, Mare?" Toby asked, glancing over as he pulled the van into the cracked asphalt parking lot of the Starlight Diner. The setting sun was painting the desert in long copper streaks behind them. "Della's been holding our booth since lunch. She told me yesterday she's saving the last slice of cherry pie just for you." Maren's mouth pulled into the lopsided smile that was the only one her body would let her make. Her right hand, the one with slightly better control, lifted and made a small circle in the air. It was their sign. It meant yes. It meant please. It meant I love you. It meant all the words she could not always make her tongue obey. Toby reached over and gently squeezed her wrist. "Cherry pie it is." He killed the engine, walked around to the passenger side, and began the slow, careful ritual of unloading his sister. The hydraulic ramp hissed as it lowered. He guided her motorized wheelchair down inch by inch, checking the harness, checking the foam supports, checking her face for any sign of discomfort. It took almost 5 minutes. It always took almost 5 minutes. Toby had performed this ritual so many thousands of times that he could do it in his sleep, and he probably had. The little brass bell above the door of the Starlight Diner jingled as he wheeled her inside. The smell hit them first. Dark roast coffee that had been brewing since dawn. Bacon grease layered into the seasoning of the cast iron grill. Cherry pie cooling on the windowsill behind the pass-through window where the cook had set it specifically because he knew Maren liked watching the steam rise off it. There was a faint undertone of pine cleaner from the mop bucket in the corner, and a sweetness from the worn vinyl of the booth seats that was somehow comforting in a way that made no logical sense. For most of the people who passed through the Starlight, this was just another roadside diner halfway between nothing and nowhere. A pit stop on the way somewhere better. But for Maren Caldwell, this place was a cathedral. There she is, there's Friday night, girl. The voice came from behind the long Formica counter. It belonged to a woman in her mid-50s with a tower of dyed honey blonde hair held in place by enough hairspray to be a fire hazard. Her name was Della Voss. She had worked at the Starlight Diner for 9 years, and in those 9 years, she had become something between an aunt and a guardian angel to the Caldwell siblings. Della had a smile that could thaw a Wyoming winter and an arm that could throw out a drunk twice her size, and she had used both on different occasions in service of the people she loved. Della emerged from behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. She moved straight to Maren's wheelchair and bent down so that her face was level with the girls. "How's my favorite artist tonight, Sweet Pea?" Maren made the small circle in the air. Her fingers were already itching for her charcoal. I figured." Della straightened up and turned to Toby. "Big boots clean and waiting. I dusted the salt and pepper shakers myself." She paused, and her eyes, which were sharper than her honey-soft voice ever let on, studied his face for a long beat. "You look tired, baby. You eating?" "I'm eating, Della." "You eating real food or just whatever's in the gas station microwave?" "Real food." "Liar." Toby almost smiled. He guided Maren's wheelchair to the large semicircular corner booth at the back of the diner, the one that faced the door. The one with the window that looked out across the desert. It was Maren's booth. Everyone in the Starlight knew it was Maren's booth. There was an unspoken law about it. Truckers who tried to claim it on Friday evenings were politely redirected by Della before they ever got their coats off. Even the locals had learned over the past 2 years to leave the corner booth alone after 5 o'clock on a Friday. Toby positioned the wheelchair so that Maren could see the whole room. He set her sketchbook on the table in front of her. He laid out her thick charcoal pencils, the ones she could grip without losing her grasp, in a careful row. And then he kissed the top of her head. "I'm gonna grab us coffee. You start drawing whoever you want." Maren was already opening her sketchbook. The thing nobody outside of the Starlight Diner truly understood about Maren's sketchbook was the discipline of it. A casual observer might have looked at her work and called it a hobby, a way for a disabled child to pass the time, a coping mechanism. None of those descriptions came within 100 miles of the truth. What Maren did every Friday evening at the corner booth of the Starlight Diner was bear witness. She drew the trucker at the counter with the wedding band tan line in the empty ring finger. She drew the elderly couple in booth 4 who always ordered 1 slice of pie and 2 forks. She drew the night cook through the pass-through window, sweat beading on his forehead under the heat lamps. She drew the regulars and the strangers, the laughing and the lonely, the kind and the cruel. She drew them all with the patient precision of someone who knew that every face contained a story and every story deserved to be remembered. And when something happened in the Starlight Diner that nobody else noticed, Maren noticed. And Maren drew it. The bell above the door jingled and a new customer walked in. Maren glanced up automatically the way she always did when the bell rang. Her eyes tracked the man for half a second. She filed his face away in the camera of her mind. Then she went back to the page. Della brought over a tray with 2 steaming mugs of coffee, one for Toby, and one heaped with extra cream and sugar for Maren. Della always claimed that nobody under 21 should be drinking coffee, But she always brought Maren a mug anyway because Maren liked the warmth of it in her hands more than she liked the taste. "Pie's coming," Della said. "Cook's just pulling it out." Toby nodded his thanks and slid into the booth across from his sister. For a little while, the world inside the Starlight Diner was as close to peaceful as the Caldwell siblings had been in a very long time. Toby drank his coffee and watched his sister work. The charcoal moved across the page with the determined slowness of a hand that fought for every line. Maren's tongue poked out the side of her mouth in concentration. Her brow furrowed. She was drawing the trucker at the counter, the one with the empty ring finger, and she was getting his sadness exactly right. Toby had been 20 years old when their parents died. Their father had been a long-haul trucker, a quiet man with a deep laugh and enormous patient hands. Their mother had been a part-time librarian who read aloud to Maren every night, even when the doctors said the words couldn't possibly mean anything to a child whose brain was wired the way Maren's was. The doctors had been wrong about that, the way doctors had been wrong about a lot of things concerning Maren. 4 years ago, on a stretch of Interstate 40 outside Flagstaff, a guardrail had failed in a 36-vehicle pileup during a sudden hailstorm. 12 people had died. Among them were Daniel and Rebecca Caldwell, who had been driving back from visiting Daniel's brother in Albuquerque. The state inspector who had certified that section of guardrail 18 months earlier had marked it as compliant with all federal safety codes. He had been lying. Toby didn't know that yet. Toby would not know that for many months. On that Friday evening in late October, sitting across from his sister in the corner booth of the Starlight Diner, Toby Caldwell believed what every official report had told him for 4 years, which was that his parents had died in a tragic accident and that there was nobody to blame and that life simply did this sometimes. He drank his coffee and he watched his sister draw and he thought about how he was going to make rent next week. His phone began to vibrate against the table. He glanced at the screen. It was his boss at Stillman's Auto Body, the Rust Bucket garage out on Route 9 where Toby worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week for cash under the table and no benefits. Toby's boss only ever called for one of two reasons. Either he wanted Toby to come in on his day off or something had gone wrong with the bomb. Toby answered, "Yeah." The voice on the other end was loud and angry and panicked all at once. There was a misplaced invoice. A customer was waiting. Toby needed to find the paperwork in the glove box of his van right now or there was going to be hell to pay on Monday morning. Toby closed his eyes and took a breath he hoped his sister couldn't hear. 5 minutes, he said. He hung up. He looked across the table at Maren, who was already watching him with concern in her bright blue eyes. "It's nothing, Mare Bear." He reached across and gently tapped the edge of her sketchbook. "I just need to grab something out of the glove box. 5 minutes. Della's right here. You keep drawing." "Okay, I want to see 2 more sketches by the time I get back." Maren made the small circle in the air. "Yes. Okay. I love you." Toby slid out of the booth, paused to brush a smudge of charcoal off his sister's nose with his thumb, and walked out of the Starlight Diner into the long Arizona twilight. The little brass bell jingled behind him. 5 minutes. 5 minutes is what he asked for. 5 minutes is what he believed he was getting. But the universe, as Toby Caldwell would learn before the night was over, did not measure time in minutes. The universe measured time in consequences. And the consequences of the next 5 minutes had been waiting for Maren Caldwell for a very long time. 2 booths over from the corner booth, Della Voss was refilling salt shakers. She glanced toward the front door as it swung shut behind Toby, and her honey-soft expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Della had been keeping watch on the corner booth in a particular way for almost 3 weeks now. Ever since the Friday night when Maren had caught her arm as she was clearing the table and pulled her down close and pressed a folded sheet of sketchbook paper into her palm and whispered 3 labored words. "For Mr. Wendell." Della had unfolded the paper in the back room alone. She had looked at what was drawn on it, and then she had walked straight to the diner's old landline and called a number she had memorized 2 years earlier. Della was watching the door now because Maren had asked her to watch the door. And in the corner booth, Maren Caldwell was already drawing again her charcoal pencil, whispering across the page, her eyes flicking up every few seconds toward the front of the diner as if she were expecting someone, or expecting something. The bell above the door jingled. It was not Toby coming back. 3 young men shoved their way into the Starlight Diner with the easy entitlement of people who had never once in their lives been told no by anyone who mattered. They were loud before the door had even finished closing behind them. Their laughter cut through the soft murmur of the diner like glass breaking. The one in front was tall and broad-shouldered, somewhere around 21 or 22, with the kind of jaw and cheekbones that came from 3 generations of careful breeding and personal trainers. He wore a navy blue designer polo with a small embroidered logo over the heart, pressed khakis, a heavy silver chain at his throat, and loafers that probably cost more than Toby Caldwell made in a month. His name was Lachlan Ashcroft, and his father owned more commercial real estate in northern Arizona than any other single individual in the state. Behind him came Corbin Vance, a thinner version of the same archetype, all sharp angles and curated arrogance. And Merritt Falk, the heavyset one, the one who laughed too loud at his friends' jokes because he had figured out a long time ago that laughing too loud was how he kept his seat at the table. They were fraternity brothers from a small private college 2 counties south. They had been drinking, not drunk yet, but loose enough to be dangerous. They had driven up to Kingman in Lachlan's father's Range Rover for what they were calling a desert weekend, which mostly meant they were going to find places to be obnoxious and assume that no consequences existed for boys who looked the way they looked and came from the families they came from. Lachlan stopped in the middle of the diner and surveyed it with the expression of a man who had just found a dead mouse in his soup. "This place is a museum," he announced loudly. "I think my grandfather got food poisoning here in the 70s. Corbin and Merritt laughed. Della Voss had already set down the salt shaker. She moved out from behind the counter with the deliberate calm of a woman who had seen a lot of trouble walk through that door over the years and had developed a sense for it. Her smile was professional. Her eyes were not. "Evening, gentlemen. You can grab any of the 4 tops by the window. I'll be right with you." Lachlan Ashcroft did not look at her. He was looking past her toward the back of the diner, toward the large semicircular corner booth where a girl in a wheelchair was hunched over a sketchbook, her hand trembling as she worked. He had stopped walking. His head had tilted slightly to the side the way a dog's head tilts when it hears a sound it doesn't quite understand. For a long, strange second, Lachlan Ashcroft just stared at Maren Caldwell. Something was scratching at the back of his mind, some itch of half-recognition. He had seen that booth before, hadn't he? He had seen this diner before, not in the daytime, the way he was seeing it now. He had seen it at night, late. He had been here with his father more than once in the past 6 months. His father had insisted on these strange middle-of-nowhere meetings out in the desert with men Lachlan didn't know, and his father had always told him to go sit at the counter and order a milkshake and not pay attention. Lachlan had ordered the milkshakes. He had not paid attention. But maybe somebody had been paying attention to him. He shook the thought off the way a man shakes off a bad dream. It was nothing. It was just an old diner. He turned his eyes back to the corner booth and the disabled girl sitting in it, and the brief uncertainty in his face hardened into something uglier. "That booth," he said, pointing. Della stepped into his line of sight. Her smile was gone now. "That booth is taken, sweetheart. Like I said, you're welcome at any of the 4 tops by the window." "That booth seats 6, Lachlan said, still pointing past her. "She doesn't even have any food. She's just sitting there scribbling. We need a big table. That booth is taken. By a kid with a coloring book. By my customer." The smile that Lachlan Ashcroft turned on Della Voss then was the smile of a young man who had been told no by a service worker exactly 0 times in his entire life and had no intention of starting a new pattern tonight. He stepped around her without breaking stride. Corbin and Merritt followed at his shoulders, snickering. Della grabbed for Lachlan's elbow. He shook her off without looking. She turned and moved fast for the counter, where the old corded landline phone was mounted on the wall next to the register. Her hand was already reaching for it. In the corner booth, Maren Caldwell looked up from her sketchbook. Her hand froze over the page. The charcoal pencil hovered. Her bright blue eyes went wide, and the color drained out of her face so fast that the freckles across the bridge of her nose stood out like flecks of paint. She knew this man. She knew his face. She knew the angle of his cheekbone and the precise gap between his front teeth and the small scar at the edge of his left eyebrow. She had drawn that scar in fine charcoal detail 3 weeks ago. She had drawn it from memory from the night she had watched him sit 2 booths over with an older man in an expensive suit, and she had watched the older man slide a thick brown envelope across the table and she had watched the other person at the table, a man with a state highway department badge clipped to his belt, take that envelope and put it inside his jacket without ever opening it. Maren had drawn all of them. She had drawn the older man with the expensive suit very, very carefully. Because 2 years ago, on a Friday evening at the Starlight Diner, when she was 12 years old and still small enough that adults sometimes forgot she was in the room Maren Caldwell had been drawing in her sketchbook, when an older man in an expensive suit sat down 2 booths away with another man, and the other man had been a state highway inspector, and the older man in the suit had said a name out loud that Maren had recognized immediately. He had said the name of the section of Interstate 40 where her parents had died. He had laughed when he said it. And Maren Caldwell, age 12, sitting alone in a corner booth nearly 2 years after the funerals, had set down her charcoal pencil and looked at the older man's face and committed every line of it to the camera of her mind. She had not understood what she was looking at. She had only understood that the man who laughed about her parents' deaths was a man whose face she would never forget for as long as she lived. His name was Garrison Ashcroft, and the young man now walking toward her booth, the one with the silver chain and the designer polo and the cruel smile, was his son. Lachlan stopped at the edge of Maren's booth. He clapped his hands together loudly, 6 inches from her face. Maren flinched so hard her wheelchair jolted backward an inch. "Hey, Wheels!" His voice was performative now, playing to his friends. "You're in our seat. Time to roll." Maren tried to speak. Her jaw worked. The effort of producing language under stress was always twice as hard as it was at rest, and right now her body was flooded with adrenaline and recognition and a fear that went deeper than this moment. The word she was trying to push out was her brother's name. Toby, Toby, Toby. But all that came out was a small broken sound that didn't resemble any word at all. "What's she even saying?" Merritt laughed. "Is she broken?" Corbin asked. "I said move," Lachlan said. Maren's trembling hand reached out across the table, not for him, but for her sketchbook. She wanted to close it. She wanted desperately to close it. Because she knew what was on the page she had been drawing. She had been working from memory. She had been recording the meeting from 3 weeks ago. She had been drawing Lachlan Ashcroft and his father and the highway inspector, and the page was open right now, face up in front of her. And if Lachlan looked down, he was going to see his own face staring back at him. She lunged for the sketchbook. Her trembling hand was too slow. Lachlan moved faster, grabbing the book off the table with awe and a sharp jerk before she could close it. His expensive polo shirt brushed her fingers as he moved. A faint smudge of charcoal dust transferred from her hand to his sleeve, no bigger than a thumbprint. Lachlan looked down at his sleeve. Then he looked down at the open sketchbook in his hand. For 1 second, the entire universe held its breath. He saw his own face. He saw the meeting at the booth. He saw the brown envelope. He saw the highway inspector with the badge clipped to his belt. He saw his own father drawn in stunning charcoal detail, sliding that envelope across the table. He saw in a 14-year-old girl's careful, painstaking photograph, perfect, rendering the exact moment in the past 6 months when his father had committed a state and federal crime, and Lachlan himself had been sitting at the counter, 12 feet away, ordering a milkshake and not paying attention. His face went white, then it went red, then it went white again. And the rage that exploded across Lachlan Ashcroft's face in the next half second was not the rage of an entitled frat boy who had just gotten dust on his shirt. It was the rage of a young man whose entire family's future had just appeared in the hand of a disabled child, and whose first and only instinct, the instinct that had been bred into him from birth, was to make the threat go away by force. "You little freak." His arm came up. It came up slow. It came up the way nightmares come up, with a terrible inevitability. Delavos saw it from 20 feet away and started running. The trucker at the counter saw it and came halfway out of his stool. Maren Caldwell saw it coming and could not move. Lachlan's open palm came down across her face with the full weight of his shoulder behind it. The crack of it hit the walls of the Starlight Diner and bounced. Maren's head snapped to the right. Her wheelchair skidded an inch backward on the linoleum. The sketchbook tumbled from Lachlan's hand and hit the floor and skidded under the next booth. Charcoal pencils rolled. Coffee spilled. Delavos's scream tore through the diner like a fire alarm. The trucker at the counter dropped his mug, and it shattered. The whole world stopped. A bright red handprint bloomed across Maren Caldwell's pale cheek like a flower opening in fast motion. She did not cry out, not at first. Her body had gone into the kind of shock that takes the voice away before it takes anything else. She just sat there very small in her wheelchair with the side of her face on fire, and one tear tracked down her uninjured cheek and fell onto the front of her denim jacket. Then the second sound came. It was a low, broken, breathless wail that did not seem like it could come from a body so small. It rose out of her like something being pulled out of the deepest part of her, and it filled the Starlight Diner the way water fills a sinking ship, and it broke every adult heart in that room straight down the middle. "You should have moved," Lachlan said, dusting off his sleeve. His voice was shaking. "I told you to move." Della Voss reached the booth. She put her body between Lachlan and Maren, and her hands were already curled into fists, and her eyes had gone to a place that the people who knew her best would later say they had never seen in her before. "You get out of my diner," she said. Her voice was not raised. It was worse than raised. It was the voice of a woman who had stopped asking. "You get out of my diner right now, or so help me God." Lachlan laughed at her. It was a thin, panicked, ugly laugh. He was already scanning the floor for the sketchbook. He needed that sketchbook. He needed it more than he had ever needed anything in his entire life. "Or what? Or you'll call the cops. My father owns half this county, lady. The cops aren't going to do a damn thing to me over a crippled kid getting a love tap." He took a step toward the booth where the sketchbook had skidded, and the windows of the Starlight Diner began to rattle. It started low, the way thunder starts when a storm is still 10 miles out. Lachlan stopped walking. He turned his head toward the front of the diner. The water glasses on the tables were trembling. The neon Starlight sign outside flickered once and held. The vibration was coming up through the soles of his expensive loafers, now climbing his calves, climbing his spine, settling in the base of his skull as a low animal warning that he had absolutely no framework to understand. The vibration got louder. It got louder. It became a sound. The sound became 30 engines. Through the dust-streaked front windows of the Starlight Diner, headlights began to bloom across the parking lot one by one, sweeping the neon sign in long, bright arcs, throwing the silhouettes of leather-clad riders against the desert dusk. They came in a tight, disciplined formation. They were not weekend warriors out for a joyride. They moved like cavalry. They moved like men who had been somewhere together 1,000 times before and would go somewhere together 1,000 times again. The engines cut out almost in unison. The silence that followed was somehow louder than the noise had been. Lachlan Ashcroft stood in the middle of the Starlight Diner with a charcoal smudge on his sleeve and a 14-year-old girl crying behind him, and he watched through the front windows as 30 men in heavy black leather dismounted from 30 Harley-Davidson motorcycles and began walking toward the door of the Starlight Diner in a slow, deliberate line. He could see the patches on their vests now, even through the dust on the windows. The unmistakable winged death's head, the bright red and white rockers above and below it, the 3 small letters that had meant something dark and serious in this country for over 50 years. Hell's Angels, Kingman Charter. At the front of the line walked a man who stood 6'5" and weighed 270 pounds and had a graying beard that reached the middle of his chest. His name was Wendell Brock, but in 3 states nobody called him that. They called him Stoneback. He had been the president of the Kingman Charter for 19 years. He had eyes the color of river flint and the patient calm of a man who had stopped being afraid of anything a long time ago. At his right shoulder walked the Charter's sergeant-at-arms, a man named Cutter Magnuson, whose forearms were thicker than most men's thighs, and who was on this particular Friday evening in a very bad mood. Cutter had been on his way home from a long ride when his phone had buzzed with a text message from a number he had memorized 2 years earlier. The text had said only 4 words. "It is happening tonight." Cutter had immediately called Stoneback, and Stoneback had immediately called every patched member within 20 miles of Kingman, and within 40 minutes, the entire active roster of the Charter was rolling toward the Starlight Diner in the hottest formation any of them had ridden in years. They had not known what they were riding into. They had only known what the 4 words meant. They had known what those 4 words had meant for 2 years now. The 4 words had come from Della Voss. Della Voss had been waiting for 2 years to send those 4 words. And the reason Della Voss had been waiting for 2 years to send those 4 words was sitting in the corner booth of the Starlight Diner right now, with a bright red handprint on her face, sobbing into the silence of a diner full of frozen strangers, while a tall young man in a designer polo shirt scrambled on his hands and knees toward the next booth, frantically reaching for a leather sketchbook that had skidded just out of his reach. The little brass bell above the door of the Starlight Diner jingled. Wendell Brock stepped through the doorway first. He had to duck slightly to clear the frame. His heavy boots came down on the checkered linoleum with a sound like a judge's gavel. Behind him, Cutter Magnuson came through the door, then Rourke Halloran, then Smitty, then Dutch, then a half-dozen others until the entrance of the Starlight Diner was completely choked with 30 leather-vested men, and the air in the room had suddenly become impossible to breathe. Stoneback's flint-colored eyes swept the diner. He saw Della Voss standing protectively in front of the corner booth, her hands curled into fists, her face streaked with tears she did not seem to have noticed crying. He saw the broken coffee mug on the floor. He saw the truck driver at the counter, half off his stool, frozen in the act of standing up. He saw Lachlan Ashcroft on his hands and knees beside the next booth, with his arms stretched out under the seat, fingers grasping toward the corner of a leather sketchbook. And then he saw Maren Caldwell. He saw the bright red handprint on her cheek and the streaks of charcoal that her trembling hand had smeared down the front of her denim jacket, and the way her small shoulders were hitching with sobs she could not get under control. He saw the 14-year-old girl who 2 years ago had wheeled herself up to him in the parking lot of this very diner on a Friday afternoon when he had stopped for coffee and had asked him in her labored, careful voice if she could please draw a picture of his motorcycle. He had said yes. She had drawn the motorcycle, and then she had drawn him, and then she had given him both drawings and refused payment, and he had taken those drawings home and pinned them to the wall of his garage, where they still hung today. He saw the girl who had been from that day forward the resident artist of the Starlight Diner, the girl who had drawn portraits of 19 of his 30 patched members for free, the girl who had asked nothing of any of them except that they hold still long enough for her to get the shading right. He saw the girl who 3 weeks ago had pressed a folded piece of paper into Della Voss's palm and whispered 3 labored words asking that paper to be delivered to him. Stoneback had looked at that paper. Stoneback had understood that night that his resident artist was in danger from somebody. She had seen somebody whose face she had drawn. He had understood that his charter was being asked to stand watch. He had not yet known why. Now looking at the bright red handprint on her cheek, he was beginning to understand. The temperature inside the Starlight Diner dropped 20 degrees. Wendell Brock took one slow step forward, and the sound of his boot on the linoleum was the loudest sound in the universe. Lachlan Ashcroft stopped scrabbling for the sketchbook. He looked up. He saw the man standing over him, and every drop of color that had been left in his face went away at once. Stoneback did not raise his voice. When he spoke, the words were low and quiet, and they carried to every corner of the diner without effort. Who put their hands on the artist? Nobody answered. Nobody had to. Della Voss raised one trembling finger and pointed straight down at Lachlan Ashcroft. And from the corner booth, through her tears, Maren Caldwell did something nobody in the diner expected. She lifted her trembling right hand off the table, and with the labored, deliberate care of a child whose body fought her for every motion, she pointed, not at Lachlan, but at the leather sketchbook, still half hidden under the next booth. She wanted them to see. She wanted Stoneback to see what was inside that sketchbook. She had been waiting 2 years for somebody to see. The brass bell above the door of the Starlight Diner jingled one more time, and Tobias Caldwell stepped back into his sister's life with an invoice in his hand and absolutely no idea that the world he had walked out of 5 minutes ago no longer existed. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the wall of leatherbacks blocking his view of the corner booth. He looked at the trail of broken coffee cup and rolled charcoal pencils on the floor. And then he saw between the shoulders of 2 enormous bikers the side of his sister's face, the bright red handprint, the tears, the small broken sounds she was still making. The invoice fell out of his hand. Maren. His voice did not sound like his own. Maren. He started to move, and the wall of leather backs parted for him without a word. The way water parts for a man walking into a river, he has every right to enter. And Toby Caldwell crossed the floor of the Starlight Diner in 5 long strides and dropped to his knees beside his sister's wheelchair and pulled her gently against his chest, and the small broken sound that came out of him Then was the sound of a brother whose heart had just been put through a press. Stoneback had not moved. He was still looking down at Lachlan Ashcroft. And Lachlan Ashcroft, kneeling on the linoleum of the Starlight Diner, with a charcoal smudge on his sleeve and a sketchbook full of his father's secrets just out of his reach, finally understood that he had walked into something tonight that his father's money was not going to be able to fix. Outside, the desert wind picked up. The neon Starlight sign flickered once and held. And in the corner booth of the Starlight Diner, with her brother's arms around her and her face throbbing and her sketchbook lying on the floor where the whole world could finally see it, Maren Caldwell stopped crying. She lifted her head off her brother's shoulder. She looked at Wendell Brock with her bright blue eyes, and through the labored mechanism of a body that had fought her for every word she had ever spoken, she pushed out the clearest sentence she had managed in months. He is the son of the man who killed our parents. The Starlight Diner went absolutely silent, and Toby Caldwell, kneeling beside his sister's wheelchair, raised his head very slowly and looked at her face, and then looked down at the sketchbook on the floor, and then looked up at Wendell Brock. And the expression that crossed his face in that moment was the expression of a man who had just been told that everything he thought he knew about the worst day of his life was a lie. Outside, somewhere far out in the dark Arizona desert, a coyote called once and went silent. Inside the Starlight Diner, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The night was just beginning. Nobody moved for what felt like a very long time. The words Maren Caldwell had just pushed out of her broken mouth hung in the air of the Starlight Diner, the way smoke hangs in a room after a gunshot. He is the son of the man who killed our parents. 11 words. 11 words that her body had fought her for, every syllable a small war, every breath of victory pulled out of muscles that had never once obeyed her without a fight. Wendell Brock stood very still in the middle of the diner floor. His flint-colored eyes moved from Maren's tear-streaked face down to the leather sketchbook still half hidden under the next booth, and then back up to Maren and then over to Lachlan Ashcroft, who was still on his hands and knees on the linoleum, frozen in the act of reaching for the book. Stoneback had stood in a lot of rooms in his 58 years of life. He had stood in courtrooms and hospital rooms, in prison visiting rooms, in the rooms where men told other men that their brothers had not come home. He had developed somewhere along the way a particular ability to read the temperature of a room before he made his next move. The temperature in the Starlight Diner right now was the temperature of a fuse that had already been lit. He bent down without taking his eyes off Lachlan, and his enormous calloused hand reached under the booth and closed around the edge of the leather sketchbook, and he pulled it out into the open. The cover was scuffed. The pages were dog-eared from 2 years of careful, painstaking use. He straightened back up to his full height, holding the book the way a man holds a thing he has just been told is sacred. He did not open it. Not yet. He turned his head toward Cutter Magnuson, who was standing at his right shoulder with both massive arms crossed over his chest and an expression of barely contained violence on his deeply scarred face. Cutter. Yeah. Door. Cutter Magnuson nodded once. He turned, walked to the front entrance of the Starlight Diner and positioned himself directly in front of it with his arms still crossed. Behind him, Smitty and Dutch and Rourke Halloran moved into a loose semicircle that closed off the front third of the diner from anyone who might have been thinking about leaving. Lachlan Ashcroft, still on his hands and knees, looked toward the door and saw the wall of leather and stopped looking. His friends Corbin Vance and Merritt Falk were already pressed against the wall near the jukebox. They had stopped laughing. Merritt's lip was trembling. Corbin's face had gone the color of old paper. They had spent the entire short lives that had brought them to this Friday evening believing that they were untouchable. They were learning in real time that untouchable was a word that other people had let them use, and the people in the Starlight Diner right now had not been consulted. Wendell Brock looked down at Lachlan. "Stand up." Lachlan stood up. His knees almost gave out doing it. Wallet, phone, keys. Lachlan's hands were shaking so badly he could barely operate his own pockets. He produced a heavy leather wallet stamped with a designer monogram, a brand new smartphone in a gold case, and the key fob to his father's $120,000 Range Rover. He held them out. Stoneback took them without comment and handed them sideways to Cutter, who held them in his palm like a man holding a fistful of small dead things. "Sit," Stoneback said. Lachlan looked around. There was no chair near him. He sat on the floor of the Starlight Diner in his pressed khakis and his designer loafers, and a sound came out of him that was not quite a opinion and not quite a word. Wendell Brock turned away from him as if he had ceased to exist. He walked the 6 paces to the corner booth. His boots made the linoleum sound like a courthouse hallway. When he reached the booth, he did not loom over Maren the way he had loomed over Lachlan. He bent his enormous frame down very slowly, lowering himself until his face was almost level with hers. Toby Caldwell was still kneeling beside his sister with one arm around her shoulders. He looked up at Stoneback with the wrecked, hollowed-out eyes of a man whose entire understanding of the past 4 years of his life had just been shoved into a blender. Stoneback's voice when he spoke to Maren was the softest sound that had ever come out of his throat. "Little bird." Maren turned her face toward him. The handprint on her cheek was beginning to swell. "You said something just now about this boy's father, about what happened to your folks." Maren's chin trembled. She made the small circle in the air with her right hand. "Did you draw it?" She made the circle again. "Yes." Stoneback held up the leather sketchbook. "In here." The third circle came slower, but it came. "Yes." Wendell Brock looked down at the book in his hand for a long moment, and then he very gently set it on the table in front of Maren. He did not open it. He understood with the instinct of a man who had spent his entire adult life around people who did not trust easily that the contents of this sketchbook belonged to the girl who had drawn them, and that whatever was inside was going to come out only when she was ready to let it come out and not a second before. He straightened up and turned to Toby. "Son?" "Yeah." Toby's voice cracked on the single syllable. "Your sister just told me something I need to understand. And I am going to ask you a question that you are going to have to answer me honestly, even if the answer is that you do not know. Do you understand?" Toby nodded. "Your folks, the accident on the interstate, 4 years ago. What did the report say?" "Guardrail failure," Toby said. He was speaking the way men speak when they have said the same words too many times. "Hailstorm, pile up, 36 vehicles." The state inspector who certified the section 18 months earlier had marked it as compliant. They told us nobody was at fault. They told us it was an accident. And you believed them. I had a 13-year-old sister in a wheelchair and $26 in my checking account. I believed what I had to believe to keep moving. Stoneback nodded slowly. He understood that answer better than Toby would ever know. "And your sister?" Stoneback's eyes flicked back to Maren. "Has she ever told you at any point in the last 4 years that she remembered something about that day, or about a man, or about a name?" "No." Toby's voice was barely there. "She has never said one word to me about any of it." Stoneback looked back down at Maren. "Why didn't you tell him, little bird?" The 14-year-old girl in the wheelchair lifted her trembling right hand and tapped very carefully on the cover of the leather sketchbook. Then she tapped her own chest. Then she tapped the sketchbook again. The gesture was small. The gesture was not small at all. I did not have the words, so I drew them. Stoneback closed his eyes for 1 second the way a man closes his eyes when something he has just realized is going to take a moment to fit it inside his ribcage. When he opened them again, there was something in his face that had not been there before. It was not anger. Anger had been there from the moment he walked through the door. This was something quieter and far more dangerous. It was the look of a man who had just been handed a long-term assignment by someone he considered family and who intended to see it through to the end. He turned back to face the rest of the diner. "Cutter?" "Yeah." "Bring the boy his phone." Cutter walked across the diner and dropped Lachlan Ashcroft's gold-cased smartphone into Lachlan's lap. Lachlan looked up at him with wet, terrified eyes. "Unlock it," Stoneback said. "Bussimayan and you were contacts. Find the one that says Dad." "Please," Lachlan's voice had gone to a high, thin place. "Please, my father is not the man you think he is. He has lawyers. He has friends in the police department. I know exactly who your father is," Stoneback said quietly. "I have known who your father is for 10 minutes. I am going to know him a great deal better by morning. Open the contact." Lachlan opened the contact. His thumb shook so badly he had to try 3 times. "Put it on speakerphone, hand it to me." Lachlan did. Stoneback took the phone in his enormous hand and held it up between himself and the corner booth so that Maren and Toby could both hear, and so that every single patched member standing in the Starlight Diner could hear. He hit the call button. The phone rang twice. A clipped, irritated voice answered. Lachlan, in a meeting. What? Mr. Ashcroft. There was a pause on the other end of the line. It was a very small pause. But it was the pause of a man whose body had just felt a temperature change that his brain had not yet caught up to. Who is this? Where is my son? Your son is sitting on the floor of the Starlight Diner in Kingman, Arizona. My name is Wendell Brock. People call me Stoneback. I am the president of the local charter of the Hells Angels. The pause on the other end of the line got longer. When Garrison Ashcroft's voice came back, all the irritation had been carefully boxed up and put away. The voice that replaced it was the voice of a man who had built an empire out of knowing exactly what every word he said was worth. Mr. Brock, it has been a long time. I am surprised to be hearing from you. It has been 10 years. It has been 10 years. To what do I owe the call? Your son walked into the Starlight Diner this evening with two of his friends. He decided that the corner booth was his by birthright. There was a young lady already sitting in that booth, a young lady I am very fond of. Your son backhanded her across the face with his full body weight, Mr. Ashcroft. He left a handprint on a 14-year-old girl with cerebral palsy, and then he laughed about it. Silence on the other end of the line. He did what? You heard me. Mr. Brock, there has been... Mr. Ashcroft, before you finish that sentence, I want you to understand something. I have 30 patched members standing in this diner right now. I have a head waitress with a memory like a steel trap. I have 4 security cameras with full audio, 2 of which have a clear angle on your son's face at the moment he raised his hand. I have a truck driver at the counter who is willing to swear in court that he saw the entire thing. I have a young man standing next to me whose last name is going to mean something to you in about 30 seconds. And I have sitting in the booth right in front of me a leather sketchbook. The silence on the other end of the line had a different quality now. It was the silence of a man who had just walked into a dark room and felt something brush past his ankle. What sketchbook? Garrison Ashcroft said. That is the wrong question, Mr. Ashcroft. The right question is what is in the sketchbook? What is in the sketchbook? You are. The pause that followed was the longest one yet. Wendell Brock looked over at Toby Caldwell, who was still kneeling beside his sister, and Stoneback's flint-colored eyes asked a question without speaking. Toby met his gaze. Toby understood the question. And Toby Caldwell, 24 years old, 4 years orphan, $200 in his checking account, made a decision in the corner booth of the Starlight Diner that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He nodded once. Stoneback turned back to the phone. Mr. Ashcroft, I am going to put a young man on this phone in a moment. His name is Tobias Caldwell. His sister is the young lady your son just slapped. His parents were a man named Daniel Caldwell and a woman named Rebecca Caldwell. They died on Interstate 44 years ago in a 36-vehicle pileup caused by a guardrail failure. A guardrail that had been certified compliant 18 months before the accident by a state highway inspector named Lawrence Pell. On the sound that came through the phone speaker was the sound of a wine glass being set down very carefully on a hard surface somewhere far away. I do not know what you are implying, Mr. Brock. I am not implying anything, Mr. Ashcroft. I am telling you that there is a sketchbook on the table in front of me containing a charcoal drawing of you handing a brown envelope to Lawrence Pell across a booth in this very diner. The drawing was made by a 14-year-old girl with a photographic memory. She drew the inspector's badge. She drew the envelope. She drew your face. I have not opened the book yet. I am going to open it in about 30 seconds. And then I am going to decide what to do with it. The line went completely silent. For a moment, Stoneback thought Garrison Ashcroft had hung up. Then a new voice came through. The voice was lower. The voice was carefully controlled. The voice was the voice of a man who had just been informed that the foundations of a 30-year empire might possibly be made of sand. Mr. Brock, what do you want? I do not want anything, Mr. Ashcroft. I am a courier this evening. I am about to put Tobias Caldwell on this phone. You are going to listen to what he says. You are going to give him an honest answer. And then we will all decide what happens next. Wendell Brock held the gold-cased smartphone out toward Toby Caldwell. Toby took it in a hand that did not feel like his own. He looked down at his sister. Maren was watching him with her bright blue eyes very wide, and there was no fear in them anymore. There was something else. There was the look of a girl who had been waiting 2 years for somebody to finally hear her, and she was watching her brother be the first person to listen. Toby raised the phone to his ear. "Mr. Ashcroft?" "Yes." "My name is Tobias Caldwell. My parents' names were Daniel and Rebecca Caldwell. They died on April 19th, 4 years ago. I want you to say something to me." "What?" "I want you to say their names out loud." The pause this time was the worst of them all. "Daniel and Rebecca Caldwell. You said their names just fine, Mr. Ashcroft. You said them like a man who has said them before. Like a man who has thought about them. Like a man who has at some point in the last 4 years sat in a quiet office somewhere and rolled those two names around in his mouth and weighed what they cost him and decided it was worth it. Mr. Caldwell, I am not finished. My sister is 14 years old. She has cerebral palsy. She has not had real physical therapy in 2 years because we cannot afford it. Her wheelchair is held together with electrical tape and her own determination. Tonight, your son walked into the only place on this earth where she feels safe, and he hit her in the face with his full body weight, and the only reason she is not in worse condition right now is that 30 bikers happen to be in the parking lot. I am going to tell you what is going to happen, and you are going to listen, and you are not going to argue with me. I am listening. By 9 o'clock Monday morning, you are going to wire $25,000 into a medical trust account. The account will be in my sister's name. That money will pay for her physical therapy for the next 2 years. That money will pay for the new wheelchair she has needed since she was 12. That money will pay for some of the things you took from her 4 years ago when you decided that a guardrail on Interstate 45 was a line item you could afford to have looked at the other way. Mr. Caldwell, I have not. I am still talking. After you wire that money, you are going to leave my family alone. You are not going to send anyone to this diner. You are not going to send anyone to my apartment. You are not going to make a single phone call about us. You are going to take your son home tonight after we are done with him, and you are going to teach him what his hands are for. And in exchange, the sketchbook is going to stay closed. For now, the drawings are going to stay in this booth. The footage from the cameras in this diner is going to stay in this diner. I am not going to take any of it to the police. I am not going to take it to the newspapers. I am not going to take it anywhere. A long, careful breath on the other end of the line. And if I do not agree, Toby Caldwell looked down at his sister, who was watching him with her bright blue eyes, and something in his face changed in a way that made Wendell Brock proud to be standing next to him. Then by Tuesday morning, every newspaper in Arizona is going to know what is in this sketchbook. Every television station in 3 states is going to know about a 14-year-old girl by cerebral palsy who watched you bribe a state highway inspector 8 months after your decisions killed her parents. The Federal Department of Transportation is going to know. The FBI is going to know. Lawrence Pell is going to know that the sketchbook exists, and Lawrence Pell is going to flip on you the second a federal prosecutor walks into his living room. You will lose every zoning permit you have in front of the city council. You will lose your real estate license. You will lose your business. And then you will lose your freedom. And the only thing you will have left, Mr. Ashcroft, is a son who watched it happen because he could not control his hand in a roadside diner. The silence that followed lasted a full 8 seconds. The wire will be there by 9 o'clock Monday morning, Mr. Caldwell. Routing numbers. Della Voss has them. She will text them to you in the next 10 minutes from this number. Understood. Your son and his friends are going to spend the next 2 hours mopping the floors of this diner. When they are finished, they will walk back to wherever they came from. Their vehicle is staying in this parking lot until the wire clears. Do you have a problem with that, Mr. Ashcroft? No problem. Good night, Mr. Ashcroft. Toby Caldwell hung up the phone. He stood in the middle of the Starlight Diner with his hands still around the gold case, and his entire body began to shake very slowly the way a building shakes after a small earthquake has just passed underneath it. Wendell Brock reached out and took the phone gently from his hand, and Della Voss came up on his other side and put her arm around his shoulders, and Toby Caldwell sat down hard in the booth across from his sister and put his face in his hands and did not cry but came very close. Maren reached across the table. She reached across with her trembling right hand, and she put her fingers very carefully on top of her brother's wrist, and she squeezed once. "I am sorry," Toby said into his hands. "I am so sorry, Mare. I should have known. I should have asked. I should have—" She squeezed his wrist again, harder this time. He looked up. She shook her head once slowly. "No." Then she made the small circle in the air with her free hand. "Yes, I love you. I love you. I love you." Out by the front door of the diner, Cutter Magnuson was already handing mops and buckets of soapy water to Lachlan Ashcroft and Corbin Vance and Merritt Falk. Delavos had emerged from the back with cleaning supplies and an expression that suggested she had been waiting her entire career for an excuse to make 3 rich boys scrub her floors. The 3 young men stripped off their expensive jackets and rolled up their designer sleeves, and for the next 2 hours, the only sounds in the Starlight Diner were the wet slap of mop heads against linoleum, the soft conversations of the bikers settling in for coffee and pee, and the occasional whimper from one of the young men when Cutter pointed at a spot they had missed. Maren did not watch them. Maren was drawing. She had pulled her sketchbook back across the table. She had opened it to a fresh page. And with her trembling right hand and the most determined expression Wendell Brock had ever seen on a 14-year-old face, she was sketching something new. Stoneback slid into the booth next to Toby and watched her work. He did not say anything. After about 10 minutes of careful, painful, beautiful effort, Maren turned the sketchbook around and pushed it across the table toward him. Wendell Brock looked down at the page. She had drawn a portrait of him standing in the middle of the Starlight Diner with 30 leather backs arrayed behind him, like a wall, and a 14-year-old girl in a wheelchair sitting in the booth in front of him, and she had drawn the angle so that you could see very faintly that the wall of leather in the booth and the girl and the man were all part of the same continuous shape. She had drawn the whole thing as one body. She had drawn family. Underneath, in shaky charcoal letters, she had written one word: Guardians. Wendell Brock did not say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than it had been all evening. "Little bird, I'm going to tell you something I have never told anybody. I have been a member of this club for 31 years. I have ridden through every state in this country and most of 2 others. I have buried 15 brothers. I have a daughter your age living in Reno who I have not seen in 11 years because of choices her mother made and choices I made in a court that did not see things our way. I have a wall in my garage with 8 drawings on it that you gave me over the past 2 years. I look at that wall every morning before I leave for work." He swallowed. "I am going to put this one on that wall too." Maren made the small circle in the air. Yes, Stoneback reached into the deep inner pocket of his leather cut. He pulled out a small rectangular patch of black leather stitched in red and white thread with the words, "Support 81 Kingman." He laid it on the table in front of Maren. "This is yours. Your brother is going to sew it on your jacket. From now on, anywhere you go in the state of Arizona, anybody who sees this patch is going to know who you belong to. And anybody who does not know what it means is going to find out fast." Maren picked up the patch with both trembling hands and held it against her chest. She did not cry. She had cried enough for one Friday night. She just held the patch against her chest and looked at Wendell Brock with her bright blue eyes, and she nodded once very slowly, and the nod said "thank you" better than her mouth could have. By the time Lachlan Ashcroft and his friends had finished mopping every square inch of the Starlight Diner, it was nearly 11 o'clock at night. They had blistered hands and ruined clothes and the broken expressions of 3 young men whose understanding of the world had been forcibly rewritten in the course of a single evening. Cutter Magnuson walked them to the door. He opened it for them with exaggerated politeness. He told them in a very calm voice that the walk back to their college dormitory was 23 miles and that he hoped the night air did them some good. Then he closed the door behind them and threw the deadbolt. Lachlan Ashcroft stood in the parking lot of the Starlight Diner under the flickering neon sign, and he looked back through the dust-streaked window one time at the corner booth where the disabled girl was still sitting with her sketchbook. She was drawing again. Already. After everything he had done to her, her trembling hand had picked up the charcoal pencil and gone back to work the way a person goes back to a prayer they have been saying their entire life. Something inside Lachlan Ashcroft cracked open in that moment, and a small, cold voice that he had never heard before spoke quietly inside his skull, and the voice said, You have spent your whole life on the wrong side of every room you have ever walked into. He turned away from the window because he could not bear to look anymore, and he started walking east on Route 66 with his two silent friends behind him, and he did not say one word to either of them for the next 23 miles. Inside the diner, Wendell Brock walked back to the corner booth and sat across from Maren and Toby one more time. The other patched members had spread out across the diner. Some were drinking coffee. Some were eating pie that Della had refused to let them pay for. The atmosphere had shifted into something almost peaceful. It was the peace that comes after a hard thing has been done and done correctly. Stoneback looked at Toby. "Son, I want to talk to you about your work situation." Toby looked up. "My work situation? You work at Stillman's, out on Route 9. Yeah. Stillman is a man I have known for 16 years. He pays his mechanics under the table. He does not provide medical insurance. He keeps his lights on by cutting corners I would not cut on a lawnmower. I am not going to insult you by asking what he pays you because I already know. I want to make you an offer. An offer. The charter runs a custom fabrication and restoration shop down by the old rail yard. We work on classic motorcycles and pre-1980 American iron. We need a mechanic who can hear a carburetor running lean from across a garage. Cutter tells me you rebuilt the transmission on that Econoline van out there twice. Is that true?" "Yes, sir." "Show up Monday morning at 8 a.m. Ask for Rourke Halloran. He will get you set up with a bay and a fresh set of coveralls. The pay is union scale. We provide full medical and dental, and your sister will be on the family plan from your first day. You will work Tuesday through Saturday. You will have Sundays and Mondays off, so you can be home with Maren in the mornings before her physical therapy appointments, which I am going to ask Della to set up for you tomorrow with a clinic in Phoenix that I have a personal relationship with." Toby Caldwell stared at him. He stared at him for a very long time. His mouth opened and closed a few times. His hands came up to his face. He scrubbed them down across his jaw hard, the way a man scrubs at his face when he is trying very hard not to come apart in front of other people. "Why," he said finally, "why are you doing this for us?" Wendell Brock looked at Maren. Maren was watching him. "Because 2 years ago," Stoneback said, "your sister wheeled herself up at me in this parking lot and asked me if she could draw a picture of my motorcycle. Because nobody had asked me anything like that in about 30 years. Because she gave me the drawing afterward and refused to let me pay her for it. Because every man in this charter has a drawing of his motorcycle on his garage wall, now courtesy of your sister, and not one of us paid her a single dollar for any of them. We owe her son. We have owed her for 2 years. Tonight is the night we start paying her back." Toby could not speak. He just nodded. Stoneback stood up. He turned to Della Voss, who had been standing nearby with 2 fresh slices of cherry pie on a tray. "Della." "Yes, Stone." "Thank you for the call. Took you long enough to answer. I was on a ride." "You always are." Stoneback almost smiled. Then he turned and walked toward the door, and Cutter and Smitty and the rest of the patch members began to follow him out into the parking lot. And within a few minutes, the Starlight Diner was once again filled with the rolling thunder of 30 Harley-Davidson engines coming to life, and the windows rattled in their frames one more time, and then the engines pulled out onto Route 66 and rode east into the desert night. Only one biker stayed behind. His name was Rourke Halloran. He was a thin, weathered man in his early 60s, with white hair pulled back into a short ponytail and a pair of reading glasses tucked into the breast pocket of his leather cut. He was the master mechanic at the charter's restoration shop. He was the man Toby had just been told to report to on Monday morning. He sat down across from Toby in the corner booth, and he looked at him for a long moment without speaking. "Son," he said finally, "there is something I need to tell you. Wendell told me to tell you tonight before you go home, because he says you are owed it." Toby looked at him. "Owed what?" "On April 19th, 4 years ago, I was riding back from a charter event in Albuquerque. I was about 1.5 miles east of the pileup when it happened. I was one of the first people on the scene. I was directing traffic and pulling people out of cars for almost an hour before the state troopers got there in any real numbers." Toby's hands went very still on the table. "I want you to listen to me carefully, son, because what I am going to tell you next is not something I have told anyone in 4 years." "Okay." There was a white Toyota Corolla turned on its side about 30 feet from the failed guardrail. There were two adults in the front seats. They were already gone by the time I got to them. There was a small girl in the back seat in a child's safety harness modified for special needs. She was alive. She was not crying. She was looking up at me with the biggest blue eyes I had ever seen on a child, and she was holding a small charcoal pencil in her right hand, and there was a sketchbook on the floor of the car next to her, and the sketchbook was open to a drawing she had been working on when the accident happened. She had been drawing a picture of her father at the wheel. Toby Caldwell made a sound. It was not quite a word. "I cut the harness," Rourke Halloran said. "I lifted her out of that car. I carried her to the shoulder of the road, and I sat with her until the EMTs came. She did not cry once. She did not say one word the whole time. She just held that pencil in her right hand, and she would not let go of it. The EMT had to pry it out of her fingers when they put her on the stretcher. And I remember thinking, this is a child who is going to remember everything. This is a child who is going to remember every single thing about today for the rest of her life in pictures." He looked across the booth at Maren. Maren was staring back at him with her bright blue eyes, and her trembling right hand had come up to her own mouth, and she was crying without making any sound at all. "I gave a statement to a state trooper that day," Rourke said quietly. "I told him about the little girl in the back seat. I told him she was alive. I gave him a description of the car and a description of the parents. I told him to make sure she got to a hospital and that somebody contacted her family. I went back to my charter that night, and I told Wendell about her. I told him about her eyes and the pencil and the sketchbook." He swallowed. 2 years later, on a Friday afternoon, Wendell stopped by the Starlight Diner on his way back from a ride, and a girl in a wheelchair rolled up to him in the parking lot and asked if she could draw his motorcycle. He came back to the shop that night and described her to me, and I knew. I knew the second he started describing her eyes. Toby could not speak. "We have been watching you for 2 years, Tobias Caldwell. The whole charter has been watching. We never said a word because we did not want to scare you, and we did not want to make your sister uncomfortable, and we figured that whenever the moment came that you needed us, you would find your way to us. And tonight you did." Maren reached across the table. She reached for Rourke Halloran's hand. He gave it to her without hesitating. Her trembling fingers closed around his weathered ones, and she squeezed once very hard, and then she did something nobody at that table expected. She pulled the leather sketchbook back across the table. She opened it, and she began to flip through the pages slowly, deliberately, page by page by page, until she stopped at one near the back of the book. The drawing on that page was of a man with white hair pulled back in a short ponytail, holding a small charcoal pencil up to the light, examining it like it was the most precious object in the world. Underneath, in shaky charcoal letters, she had written one word: remembered. Rourke Halloran put his face in his hands. The Starlight Diner was very quiet. After a long moment, Maren turned to her brother. She pulled the sketchbook closer to her, and with her trembling right hand, she began to flip backwards through the pages. Page after page after page. Toby watched her, and as the pages turned, the contents of the sketchbook began to reveal themselves to him for the first time. There were 47 of them. 47 drawings of a man in an expensive suit sitting in various corners of the Starlight Diner, meeting with various other men. A drawing of him handing an envelope to a man with a state highway department badge. A drawing of him sitting across from a woman in a city council pen. A drawing of him with a man Toby vaguely recognized from a local newspaper as a county commissioner. A drawing of him with a man wearing a sheriff's department uniform. Page after page after page. 47 faces, 47 meetings, 47 small, careful, photograph-perfect documentations of every single person Garrison Ashcroft had bribed in the past 2 years, inside the Starlight Diner, drawn from memory by a 14-year-old girl with cerebral palsy who had been sitting 2 booths away the whole time, completely invisible to him, completely unimportant, completely beneath his notice. She stopped at the page with the highway inspector. She put her trembling finger on the brown envelope in the drawing. Then she put her finger on Garrison Ashcroft's face. Then she put her finger on the inspector's badge. Then she looked up at her brother. She opened her mouth, and the labored, broken sentence that came out of Maren Caldwell was the clearest sentence she had spoken in months. "Brother, help me. Tell The story. Tobias Caldwell looked down at the sketchbook. He looked at his sister. He looked at Rourke Halloran, who was still wiping his eyes with the back of his weathered hand. He looked at Della Voss, who had come up beside the booth without anyone noticing and was standing with her arms crossed and her own eyes shining. He looked at the 47 drawings. He thought about a guardrail on Interstate 45. He thought about a hailstorm. He thought about a phone call he had received 4 years ago from a state trooper telling him that his parents were gone and his 13-year-old sister was in the hospital and somebody was going to need to come and get her. He thought about the 4 years of debt and exhaustion and grief and silence that had followed. He thought about a man in an expensive suit who had laughed about a section of Interstate 8 months after Toby's parents had died on it. He looked at his sister. Yes, Tobias Caldwell said. His voice did not shake. Yes, Maren, we are going to tell the story. We are going to tell the whole story, and we are going to tell it loud enough that the man who killed our parents hears us all the way down in his fancy office in Phoenix. Maren made the small circle in the air with her trembling right hand. Yes, outside, far out in the dark Arizona desert, a coyote called once, and another one answered it from the other side of the highway, and the long October night settled over the Starlight Diner. And somewhere far to the south, in a glass-walled office on the top floor of a building he owned, outright Garrison Ashcroft was sitting at his desk, staring at a phone he had just hung up, and for the first time in 30 years of his very careful life, he was beginning to be afraid. He did not know yet that the fear was justified. He did not know yet that the girl he had never noticed 2 booths over had been drawing him for 2 years. He did not know yet that there were 47 pages. He did not know yet that his son's slap had not been the worst thing that had happened to him on this Friday night in late October. The worst thing that had happened to him on this Friday night in late October was that a 14-year-old girl in a wheelchair had finally found someone to help her tell the story. And in a corner booth at the Starlight Diner, with her brother on one side of her and a 60-year-old biker on the other, and a leather sketchbook open in front of her containing 2 years of patient, silent, meticulous testimony, Maren Caldwell turned to a fresh page and picked up her charcoal pencil and began very slowly and very carefully to draw the next chapter. 6 months can change a life, and 6 months had changed the lives of the Caldwell siblings in ways that neither of them could have imagined on the night the coffee cup hit the floor. It was a bright Tuesday morning in late April. The Arizona desert had shaken off its winter chill and was beginning to bloom in the quiet, secret way the desert blooms when nobody is watching. Tobias Caldwell stood in the kitchen of a small but clean 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Kingman, pouring orange juice into a glass with both hands steady for the first time in 4 years. He was wearing a clean denim work shirt with the Route 66 custom fabrication logo embroidered over the left breast pocket. There was a fresh haircut on his head and a small amount of color in his face that had not been there 6 months ago. His hands still carried the permanent dark stain of engine grease, but the stain belonged to a different kind of work now, a kind that paid him union scale and full medical and dental and gave him every Sunday and Monday off to be with his sister. Maren Caldwell sat at the kitchen table in her new wheelchair. The new chair had been the very first thing Toby had bought after Garrison Ashcroft's wire transfer cleared at 9 o'clock on the Monday morning following the slap. It was a custom-built motorized model with hydraulic suspension lumbar support contoured to her exact spinal shape, and a side-mounted easel arm that could swing into position whenever she wanted to draw. The chair had cost almost $9,000. Maren had cried when she first sat in it, not because of the chair, because of what the chair meant, which was that someone had finally believed she was worth the investment. The physical therapy clinic in Phoenix had done the rest. Twice a week for 6 months, Toby had loaded his sister into the new wheelchair-accessible van that Rourke Halloran and the rest of the Route 66 crew had quietly built for him in their off hours, and he had driven her 2.5 hours south to a state-of-the-art neurological rehabilitation center that specialized in cerebral palsy in adolescents. The doctors there had done things with her muscles and her balance and her speech patterns that Maren had not believed were possible. She still could not walk. She would never walk in the sense that most people understood walking, but her tremors had softened by almost 40%. Her core was stronger. She could now hold her right hand steady for nearly a minute at a time without fatigue. And her speech, while still labored, had become clearer and more confident the way a radio signal becomes clearer when you finally tune to the right frequency. She could finish sentences now. She could finish them in front of strangers. Bum. She finished one now, looking up at her brother as he set the glass of orange juice in front of her. Della called. She wants us at the diner tonight. Toby looked over from the counter. Tonight, it is a Tuesday. We do not go to the diner on Tuesdays. She said, it is important. Did she say what? Maren shook her head slowly. The look in her bright blue eyes said that she had her own suspicion and that her suspicion was not a happy one. Toby studied her face for a moment, then nodded once and went back to packing her lunch. He had learned in the past 6 months that when his sister felt strongly about something, the right thing to do was move in the direction she was pointing without asking too many questions. That evening, when they pulled the wheelchair-accessible van into the cracked asphalt parking lot of the Starlight Diner, Toby knew immediately that something was wrong. The lot was empty. On a Tuesday evening in late April, the lot should have had at least 4 or 5 vehicles in it. There should have been a couple of long-haul trucks at the back of the lot, an old Buick or two belonging to the regulars. Maybe a tourist family from out of state stopped for pie. Instead, the lot held exactly 2 cars. Della Voss's old Subaru and a sleek black Lincoln Town car that did not belong to anybody in Kingman. Toby helped his sister out of the van. They went inside. Della was standing behind the counter with both hands flat on the formica and her honey blonde tower of hair slightly less perfect than usual. Sitting at the counter with his back to the door was a thin man in an expensive gray suit drinking a cup of coffee and looking around the diner with the bored expression of an undertaker measuring a body for a coffin. Della looked up when the bell jingled. The expression on her face went straight through Toby and landed somewhere in the back of his ribcage. Toby, honey, wheel her over here, please. Both of you need to hear this. The thin man in the gray suit turned around on his stool. He had a clipboard in his hand and a small professional smile that did not reach his eyes. He nodded politely at Maren and at Toby. Mr. Caldwell, Miss Caldwell, my name is Edmund Vance. I am with Apex Desert Holdings, a real estate development company headquartered in Phoenix. I represent the new owners of this property. Toby went still. What do you mean the new owners? Mr. Henderson, the previous owner of the Starlight Diner, accepted a private offer on this lot 11 days ago. The escrow closed yesterday afternoon. As of this morning, the parcel of land you are currently standing on is the legal property of Apex Desert Holdings. Della was watching Maren's face. Maren had not moved. What is going to happen to the diner? Toby said. Edmund Vance gave the small professional smile again. The Starlight Diner will be cleared from the lot beginning the 2nd week of June. My client intends to break ground on a 14,000 square foot luxury commercial development by July 1st. The plans include 3 high-end retail tenants, a coffee franchise, and a small wine bar. The aesthetic of the development will, I am told, draw inspiration from quote-unquote authentic Route 66 charm, which I believe is meant ironically. You are tearing down the diner. That is correct. Miss Voss has been provided with a 30-day eviction notice for the staff and any personal belongings on the premises. I am here this evening as a courtesy to make sure that the news is delivered in person rather than through the mail. He stood up, set a business card on the counter, and adjusted the cuff of his expensive jacket. My client asked me to deliver one additional message to the Caldwell family specifically. He asked me to say, and I am quoting directly here, please tell them that some debts take longer to collect than others, but they always come due. Have a pleasant evening. Edmund Vance walked past the corner booth on his way to the door. He glanced down at Maren as he passed her. He gave her the same small professional smile he had given everyone else, and there was something in the smile that made Toby Caldwell's hands curl into fists at his sides. The brass bell above the door jingled. The black Lincoln Town car pulled out of the parking lot. For a long moment, none of the 3 people remaining inside the Starlight Diner said anything. Then Della Voss sat down hard on a stool at the counter and put her face in her hands. He is doing this on purpose, she said into her palms. He cannot get to the 3 of you any other way without admitting what he did. The sketchbook keeps him from coming after you directly. So he is taking the only thing left. He is taking the place. He is taking us. Toby looked at her. We have the sketchbook, Della. We have the drawings. We can release them. We can put 47 pieces of evidence in front of every prosecutor in the state of Arizona by tomorrow morning. And Garrison Ashcroft will have his lawyers in front of those same prosecutors by tomorrow afternoon. Honey, I have spent 6 months watching this situation. I have watched him move money. I have watched him reorganize his shell companies. I have watched him quietly retire the names of 3 of the men in your sister's drawings and replace them with new ones. He has been preparing for this fight since the night you put him on a speakerphone. If we go nuclear with the sketchbook now, we win the criminal case eventually, but we lose this diner today, and we lose every chance we ever had of doing this on our own terms. She raised her face from her hands. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set. He bought the diner because he wants us to use the sketchbook. He wants us to panic. He wants us to fire our biggest bullet at the wrong target while he keeps eating the things we love. Toby looked at the corner booth. He looked at the long Formica counter. He looked at the missing T and the neon starlight sign outside the dust-streaked window. He thought about the Friday evenings of the past 2 years. He thought about a 14-year-old girl in a wheelchair who had drawn 19 portraits of his patched brothers for free. He thought about a cherry pie in the window. He thought about a brass bell. He thought about a coffee cup hitting the floor and a slap and a charcoal pencil rolling across the linoleum. He turned to his sister. Maren, I am out of ideas. I do not know how to fight this one. Maren Caldwell did not answer him right away. She wheeled her new chair forward 2 feet until she was directly in the middle of the diner, and she looked slowly around the room. She looked at the corner booth. She looked at the counter. She looked at the brass bell above the door. She looked at the kitchen pass-through window where the night cook used to set the cherry pies to cool. She looked at every inch of the place where she had spent the most important Friday evenings of her short life, and her bright blue eyes filled with a kind of light that her brother had never seen in them before. Then she reached down to the side of her wheelchair. She unzipped a small canvas bag attached to the frame. She pulled out a thick manila envelope. She set the envelope on the counter in front of Della Voss. "Open it," she said. The 2 words came out clear and steady. Della picked up the envelope. Her hand was shaking. She slid out the contents. The contents were a stack of papers about 1/2 inch thick. The top sheet was a printed letter on the official letterhead of the Phoenix Tribune, the largest newspaper in the state of Arizona. The letter was addressed to Maren Caldwell. The letter was signed by an investigative reporter named Whitfield Aldrich. The letter said in summary that Mr. Aldrich had received a package 1 month ago containing scanned copies of 47 charcoal drawings, a handwritten letter from a 14-year-old artist explaining what each drawing represented, and a request that he investigate the contents quietly and professionally without contacting the artist directly until she contacted him. The letter went on to say that Mr. Aldrich had spent the past month corroborating the contents of the drawings with public records building permits, State Highway Department personnel files, and 3 confidential sources within the office of the Arizona Attorney General. The letter said that the story Mr. Aldrich was now prepared to write was the largest single corruption scandal in the modern history of the state of Arizona. The letter said that Mr. Aldrich had also on his own initiative contacted a senior special agent at the Phoenix field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and that the senior special agent had expressed significant interest. The letter ended with 1 sentence written in a slightly different ink as if added by hand at the last minute. "Whenever you are ready, Miss Caldwell, the country is ready to listen." Della Voss read the letter twice. She set it down on the counter very carefully, the way a person sets down a piece of glass they are afraid of breaking. "Maren, honey, when did you do this?" 3 months ago. I asked you to mail it." Della closed her eyes. She remembered. 3 months ago on a Friday evening, Maren had handed her a large manila envelope and asked her in her labored voice to please drop it at the post office on her way home. Della had assumed it was a piece of artwork being mailed to a relative. She had not opened it. She had not looked inside. She had simply done what the girl she loved had asked her to do. She had been the courier of a federal corruption case for 3 months without knowing it. Toby was staring at his sister. "Maren, did you plan this?" Maren turned her bright blue eyes on her brother and gave him the lopsided smile that was the only one her body would let her make. "Brother, I have been planning for 2 years. The slap was just the signal." The air in the Starlight Diner went very quiet. Toby Caldwell sat down on a counter stool because his knees did not feel reliable anymore. He looked at his 14-year-old sister sitting in her wheelchair in the middle of the diner, and he tried to fit the sister he had been raising for 4 years into the sister who had just calmly handed him a letter from the Phoenix Tribune. The two pictures did not want to overlap at first. He had to sit with it for a moment before they did. When they finally did, his eyes filled. 2 years. 2 years. Why did you not tell me, Mare? Because you were already carrying everything. I did not want to add the weight. Toby Caldwell put his face in his hands and his shoulders shook silently. After a moment, Maren wheeled her chair over to him. She put her trembling right hand on top of his wrist, the same gesture she had made 6 months ago in this same diner, and she squeezed once. Brother, listen, we are not going to release the drawings the way they expect. He raised his head. What are we going to do to Maren? We are going to make him come to us in front of everyone. She wheeled herself back 2 feet so that she could see both her brother and Della at the same time. Her face had taken on a quality that her brother had never seen before. It was the quality of a strategist who had been waiting a very long time for the right moment and who was now about to spend every chip she had at once. Della, I want you to call Mr. Wendell. I want him to put out the word. I want the biggest motorcycle rally this town has ever seen. We are going to save the diner. We are going to call it the Starlight Run. Bikers from every state, local families, press, national news, everyone. Della was nodding slowly, taking notes on a napkin without looking down at her own pen. Honey, a rally that big needs months of planning. We have weeks. Mr. Wendell, we'll know how to do it fast. All right, and we are doing this to raise money to buy the diner back. Maren shook her head slowly. No, the money is the cover. The rally is the cover. Della stopped writing. She looked up. What is the rally actually for, Sweet Pea? Maren turned her bright blue eyes on Della Voss, and the look in them was the look of a 14-year-old artist who had finally figured out how to use the only weapon her body had ever given her. It is, so I have 3,000 witnesses and 6 television cameras. When I open the sketchbook in public for the first time, the Starlight Diner went absolutely silent. Della Voss put down her pen. You are going to release it live in front of the country. Maren nodded once. Garrison Ashcroft cannot bury a story that 3,000 people are watching with their own eyes. He cannot pay off 6 different news networks. He cannot make the FBI look the other way when the FBI is standing 20 feet from the stage. Toby was staring at his sister with an expression on his face that was somewhere between pride and terror. Maren, he is going to know what we are doing the second the rally is announced. He is going to send people. He is going to try to stop us before the day comes. Yes, Maren made the small circle in the air. That is why we are going to announce it tomorrow and hold it. 3 weeks from tomorrow, he will not have time to stop us, and he will not believe a 14-year-old with a sketchbook could ever plan something like this. He will think the bikers are doing it. He will underestimate me the way he has always underestimated me. Della Voss reached across the counter and took Maren's trembling hand in both of hers. Sweet Pea, you are the most dangerous person I have ever met. Maren smiled a lopsided smile. I learned by watching the right people. The next 3 weeks moved faster than any 3 weeks Toby Caldwell had ever lived through. Wendell Brock made the call within an hour of receiving Della Voss's message. The call went out across the entire West Coast network of the Hells Angels, and from there, it went out to every motorcycle club, every veterans group, every small business owner, every local family, and every sympathetic citizen who had ever stopped at the Starlight Diner for a slice of pie. The pitch was simple. A roadside diner that had served the community of Kingman for 43 years was being torn down by an out-of-town developer out of pure corporate spite. A 14-year-old artist who used the diner as her sanctuary was leading a charity art auction to raise funds and public awareness. The Kingman Charter was hosting. Bring your bike, bring your family, Bring your wallet. Be there. The response was beyond anything any of them had dared to imagine. Word spread on the back channels of the riding community like fire across dry brush. By the end of the first week, 300 bikers had committed. By the end of the second week, the number was up to 1,200. By the morning of the rally itself on the second Saturday in May, more than 3,000 motorcycles were rolling into the desert outside Kingman from 16 different states. The county sheriff had to close 2 miles of Route 66 to regular traffic. Local news vans had been arriving since dawn. By noon, 4 major regional news networks and 2 national cable news outlets had set up satellite trucks in the field next to the Starlight Diner parking lot, drawn by the unusual size of the gathering and the unusual story behind it. Inside the diner itself, Maren Caldwell was getting ready. She was wearing a soft blue dress that Della Voss had picked out for her. Pinned to her collar was the Support 81 patch that Wendell Brock had given her 6 months ago. Her hair had been carefully brushed, and there was a small amount of color in her cheeks that was not from makeup, but from something that had been growing inside her for 2 years and was finally about to come out. On the table in front of her sat the leather sketchbook. Beside it sat a second envelope much thinner than the one she had given Della 3 weeks ago, sealed with a red wax seal she had pressed herself. Toby Caldwell knelt in front of his sister's wheelchair. "Mare, you sure about this?" "I have never been more sure of anything. If something goes wrong out there, it will not go wrong. I have planned for everything." He swallowed. He nodded. He stood up. He took the handles of her wheelchair and pushed her slowly through the diner toward the front door, and Della Voss held the door open for them, and the brass bell above the door jingled one more time, and Maren Caldwell wheeled out into the bright Arizona sunlight to face the largest audience of her entire life. The roar that went up from the crowd when they saw her was the loudest sound any of them had ever heard. 3,000 bikers packed shoulder to shoulder in the parking lot, and the adjacent field stood up from their folding chairs and their motorcycles and their pickup truck tailgates and applauded for 90 straight seconds. The local families who had brought their children cheered. The press cameras swung toward her. The national news anchors began speaking urgently into their microphones. Wendell Brock, standing on a makeshift wooden stage at the front of the crowd, raised both hands and called for quiet, and the quiet came faster than anyone expected. Toby pushed his sister's wheelchair up the gentle ramp onto the stage. Wendell Brock met them at the top and bent down to speak softly into Maren's ear. "Little bird, whatever you need from me up here, you say the word. I need you to stand behind me, Mr. Wendell, so everyone knows I am protected." He nodded once and stepped back to a position 3 feet behind her wheelchair. Maren Caldwell rolled her chair forward to the microphone stand at the front of the stage. She did not speak right away. She looked out across 3,000 faces. She looked at the press cameras. She looked at the bright blue Arizona sky. She looked at the dust-streaked windows of the Starlight Diner just behind the crowd. And then she looked down at the leather sketchbook in her lap, and she opened it for the first time in public, and she lifted her trembling right hand and held the first page up to the cameras. The first page was a charcoal drawing of Garrison Ashcroft sitting in a corner booth of the Starlight Diner, sliding a brown envelope across the table to a man wearing a state highway department badge. The crowd went absolutely silent. "My name is Maren Caldwell. I am 14 years old. I have cerebral palsy. My parents, Daniel and Rebecca Caldwell, were killed 4 years ago on Interstate 45 by a guardrail that should have been replaced 18 months earlier." The press camera zoomed in on the drawing in her hand. "This is a picture I drew from memory of the man who paid the state inspector to certify that guardrail as compliant. The man in the expensive suit is named Garrison Ashcroft. The man with the badge is named Lawrence Pell. I drew this picture 2 years ago when I was 12 from a meeting I watched 8 months after my parents died." She set the first drawing down. She lifted the second one. "This is another picture from the same sketchbook of the same man meeting with a different public official. There are 47 drawings in this book, 47 meetings, 47 times. Garrison Ashcroft used the Starlight Diner as his private office for corruption because nobody in the Starlight Diner was important enough to matter. She lifted her bright blue eyes to the crowd. He was wrong about that. A sound rose from the 3,000 people in the field. It was not a cheer. It was something deeper than a cheer. It was the sound of 3,000 strangers understanding all at once that they were witnessing something that mattered. 6 months ago, his son, Lachlan, walked into this diner and slapped me in the face because I got charcoal on his shirt. He did not know that I had already drawn him. He did not know that I had watched him sit in the corner of this diner with his father 4 times, while his father bribed people. He did not know anything about me. He thought I was a girl in a chair with a coloring book. Garrison Ashcroft has spent 2 years thinking the same thing. She held up the leather sketchbook in both trembling hands. This is the truth. He never thought anyone would tell today 47 federal crimes are going to be entered into the public record by a girl he never bothered to look at. She turned her head slightly toward the back of the field. Special Agent Holloway from the Phoenix field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation is standing in the back of this crowd. He has been standing there since this morning, waiting for my signal so that he can take possession of the original sketchbook as evidence in a federal corruption case that has been quietly building. For 3 months, Mr. Aldrich from the Phoenix Tribune will be releasing his full investigative report online in 10 minutes. She looked directly into the nearest news camera. My name is Maren Caldwell, and the man who killed my parents is going to spend the rest of his life in federal prison because I can draw. The field exploded. It was not a cheer this time. It was something larger and stranger and more elemental than a cheer. It was the sound of 3,000 people releasing 6 months of held breath at the same time. The press cameras were rolling. The national news anchors were already calling their producers. In the back of the field, a tall man in a dark suit was moving forward through the crowd with 2 other agents flanking him, and in his hand was an evidence bag, and the crowd was parting for him without a single person asking him to. Maren Caldwell sat in her wheelchair on the stage with the sketchbook in her lap, and her bright blue eyes fixed on the horizon, and she did not move. She had said her piece. The rest was no longer her job, but the day was not finished with her yet. Through the parting crowd, walking slowly from the back of the field, came a young man in a plain gray t-shirt and faded jeans. He was not wearing a designer polo. He was not wearing loafers. He was not flanked by friends. He was completely alone, and he looked thinner than he had 6 months ago, and his eyes were wet, and he was carrying a single white envelope in his right hand. It was Lachlan Ashcroft. The crowd recognized him almost immediately. The bikers nearest him stiffened. Wendell Brock took 1 step forward on the stage. Toby Caldwell came around the side of his sister's wheelchair with his fists already curling. Maren Caldwell raised 1 trembling hand and made a small gesture that meant wait. Lachlan Ashcroft walked the entire length of the field alone. He walked past 3,000 silent strangers. He walked past the news cameras. He walked past the Hells Angels patched members who were watching him with expressions that promised violence if he so much as flinched in the wrong direction. He walked all the way to the foot of the stage, and he stopped, and he looked up at Maren Caldwell with an expression on his face that none of his fraternity brothers from 6 months ago would have recognized. Miss Caldwell, Maren looked down at him. I am not here for my father. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the silence. I am here for you. He held up the white envelope. 3 months ago, I went to Della. I told her I needed to talk. To you, I told her everything I knew about my father's business. She told me to wait. She told me that when the day came, I would know what to do This is everything I have left in the world after my father cut me off. It is $350,000. The crowd stirred. It is enough to buy the diner back from Apex Desert Holdings. The deed will transfer directly to Della Voss as trustee for the Caldwell family. The lawyer is standing behind me. He held the envelope up higher. I did not earn this money the right way. My grandmother left it to me. I never did anything to deserve it. I want to give it to the only person in my life who has ever looked at me and seen me for exactly what I was and told me the truth. He swallowed hard. I am sorry, Miss Caldwell, for what I did to you in this diner 6 months ago. I do not expect you to forgive me. I do not deserve to be forgiven. I just wanted to stop being the person who hit you. He set the envelope down on the edge of the stage. He took 2 steps backward. He bowed his head once. And then he turned and began the long walk back through the crowd alone, the same way he had come. Maren Caldwell watched him go for about 10 seconds. Then she did something nobody in that field expected. She leaned forward in her wheelchair, and with the labored, careful effort of a body that had fought her for every motion of her life, she pushed herself up onto her feet for 2 full seconds, holding the front of the microphone stand for support, and she called out across the field in the loudest voice she had ever produced. Lachlan! He stopped walking. He turned around. Come back to the diner next Friday. Sit in the corner booth. I want to draw your portrait properly. This time, the crowd held its breath. Lachlan Ashcroft put both hands over his face and stood very still for a long moment in the middle of 3,000 people. When he finally lowered his hands, his face was wet, and he nodded once toward the stage, and Maren Caldwell lowered herself slowly back into her wheelchair, and the field came apart in the loudest sound the desert outside Kingman had heard in 50 years. Special Agent Holloway reached the stage. He climbed the steps. He bent down respectfully in front of Maren's wheelchair and asked her very quietly if she was ready to release the sketchbook into federal custody. She nodded once. She handed it to him with both trembling hands. He thanked her by name. He turned to the cameras and announced in the carefully measured language of federal law enforcement that as of this moment, an active federal investigation was being opened against Garrison Ashcroft of Phoenix, Arizona, on multiple counts of bribery of public officials, conspiracy to commit fraud, and contributing to deaths arising from gross criminal negligence. Garrison Ashcroft was arrested at his home in Phoenix at 6:47 that same evening, while the cable news networks were still rolling continuous coverage of the rally. He never came home. 1 year later, on a bright Friday evening in late May, the Starlight Diner stood exactly where it had always stood. The cracked asphalt parking lot was full. The neon Starlight sign above the door was still missing its T from 2018. The brass bell above the front door still jingled when customers came in. Della Voss was behind the counter pouring coffee with her honey blonde tower of hair freshly redone for the occasion. Toby Caldwell was sitting at the long Formica counter in his Route 66 custom fabrication work shirt, reading a newspaper and eating a slice of cherry pie. Wendell Brock and Cutter Magnuson and Rourke Halloran were in their usual booth drinking coffee and talking quietly about a vintage motorcycle restoration that Toby had finished the day before. The diner was full of regulars, full of out-of-towners who had heard about the place from the news and come to see it for themselves, full of families with their children, full of life. In the large, semicircular corner booth at the back of the diner, a 14-year-old artist had grown into a 15-year-old artist with steadier hands and a clearer voice and a quiet, settled look in her bright blue eyes that had not been there 1 year ago. Maren Caldwell sat in her custom wheelchair with her leather sketchbook open in front of her, drawing the trucker at the counter with the empty ring finger, just like she always had. On the wall directly above her booth hung a single large framed charcoal drawing. It was the largest piece Maren Caldwell had ever made. It was a self-portrait. She had drawn herself sitting in the corner booth of the Starlight Diner with a charcoal pencil in her trembling right hand and her sketchbook open in her lap, looking up toward the viewer with bright blue eyes that knew exactly what they were looking at. Behind her, drawn in lighter strokes, were the faintly visible outlines of every single person who had stood in the diner with her over the past year. Her brother, Della Voss, Wendell Brock, Rourke Halloran, Cutter Magnuson, the patch members of the Kingman Charter, the truck drivers, the waitresses, the cooks, Lachlan Ashcroft sitting alone at a small table near the door finally drawn properly. Her parents just barely visible at the very back of the crowd watching their daughter with quiet pride. They were all there, every single one of them, drawn from the perfect photograph clear memory of a girl who had spent her entire life paying attention to the people the world had taught itself to overlook. Underneath the self-portrait, in shaky but determined charcoal letters, she had written the title, The Witness. The brass bell above the front door of the Starlight Diner jingled. A young man in a plain gray t-shirt walked in alone, the way he had walked in every Friday evening for the past year. He nodded politely to Della at the counter. He glanced toward the corner booth. Maren looked up from her sketchbook and made the small circle in the air with her right hand. He smiled. He walked over and slid into the seat across from her, and he picked up the second charcoal pencil she always set out for him now, and the two of them began very quietly and very carefully to draw the next chapter of a story that the man who had once tried to silence her would spend the rest of his life reading from a federal prison cell. Outside, far out in the dark Arizona desert, a coyote called once into the warm spring night, and somewhere down the highway, the distant rolling thunder of a single Harley engine answered it, and the long shadows of the Hualapai Mountains stretched gently across the parking lot of the Starlight Diner, and the neon sign above the door flickered once and held. Inside, Maren Caldwell turned to a fresh page and kept on drawing.